Everyone who knew Nick Drake says the same thing. He was unlike anyone they had ever met. And they all say something else too. Something quieter. Something that still sits uneasy with them decades later. That they didn't do enough. That nobody did. This is the story of Nick Drake told not through his music, but through the people who stood beside him and watched him disappear. Gabrielle Drake was 2 years older than her brother, an actress. Sharp, assured, the kind of person who fills a room. Nick was the opposite. Growing up, Gabrielle watched him move through the world at a different frequency to everyone else. Quieter, deeper, more interior. She told interviewers that even sharing a flat with him in Hampstead in the late 1960s, when his career was just beginning, she never truly knew what was happening inside him. She recalled the moment she first heard 5 Leaves Left, his debut album. He had not told her it was finished. He had not told her it was being recorded. He walked into her room one evening, threw the finished record onto her bed, and walked back out without a word. That was Nick Drake telling his sister he had made something extraordinary. No explanation, no pride, no need for her reaction. Just the thing itself, dropped and gone. Robert Kirby met Nick Drake at Cambridge University in 1967. He was a Baroque music scholar. Nick was studying English literature. What connected them was something harder to name than that. Nick brought Kirby his songs, early drafts, unfinished sketches, and asked him to write string arrangements around them. Kirby had never scored for a pop record before. He was 20 years old. He said yes. What emerged became the sound of 5 Leaves Left. Chamber strings draped around Nick's guitar like morning mist. It remains one of the most distinctive arrangements in British folk history. Kirby later described the collaboration as entirely intuitive. Nick rarely explained what he wanted. He would play a song once, quietly, and somehow Kirby would hear the strings that weren't there yet. Their friendship outlasted the music. When Nick retreated to his parents' house in the early 1970s, Kirby was one of the few who stayed in contact, one of the few Nick still let in. Kirby died in 2009. He spent the final decades of his life speaking publicly about Nick Drake, making sure the story was told correctly, making sure the music was understood. He said once that working with Nick was the greatest thing he ever did, and that he still thought about him every day. John Martyn was one of the great folk guitarists of his generation. Loud, warm, larger than life in every way, Nick Drake was not. They were close friends in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Nick would visit John and his wife Beverly regularly when they lived in London, and later in Hastings. By 1972, something had shifted. Nick's visits became stranger. He would arrive unannounced, sit in silence for an hour, say almost nothing, and leave. John Martyn later described Nick during this period as the most withdrawn person he had ever encountered in his life. In 1973, Martyn released an album called Solid Air. The title track, one of the most quietly devastating songs in British music, was written directly about Nick Drake. Martyn never spelled it out at the time, but he confirmed it years later. The song was his way of reaching out to someone he could not reach any other way. Nick Drake heard Solid Air. Whether it reached him the way Martyn hoped, whether anything reached him by then, is something nobody knows. Joe Boyd discovered Nick Drake at a Cambridge folk club in 1967 and produced his first 2 albums. He believed in Nick Drake the way producers rarely believe in anyone, with the kind of certainty that doesn't need to be explained. But belief has limits, and Boyd had his own life, his own career, his own city. In 1972, he moved to Los Angeles. He later wrote honestly about this in his memoir, that he left at a difficult time, that Nick was deteriorating and he was not there. In late 1973, Boyd returned to London and called Nick. He told him directly, "You are wasting your talent. You need to come back." Something in Nick responded. He picked up the guitar again for the first time in months. He wrote new songs. In 1974, they recorded together again, 4 new tracks at Sound Techniques. Boyd described the songs as extraordinary, dark and angry in a way Nick had never been before, but extraordinary. Boyd recalled that Nick's mother Molly told him she had not seen her son happy in years, and that for a brief moment, recording again, he was. Those 4 tracks were never released as an album. Nick Drake died 7 months after the sessions ended. They were eventually released years later, and they are as remarkable as Boyd said. Rodney and Molly Drake were not passive observers of their son's life. They were its anchor. When Nick could no longer manage London, they welcomed him home. When he stopped speaking, they let the silence sit. When he disappeared for days, driving without destination, borrowing his mother's car until the petrol ran out, and then calling home to be collected, they came. Molly Drake was a musician herself. She wrote songs, delicate, melancholic songs that she recorded at home on a reel-to-reel machine and never showed anyone. After her death, those recordings were discovered. When people heard them, the resemblance to her son's music was startling. The same quiet interior world. The same sense of something just out of reach. On the evening of November 24th, 1974, Nick had dinner with his parents. He had been recording new song ideas on his home tape machine that same day. His mother later said he seemed different that evening. Not better exactly, but present. More like the boy she remembered. In the early hours of November 25th, Nick Drake took a fatal overdose of amitriptyline, the antidepressant he had been prescribed for years. The coroner's official verdict was suicide while suffering from a depressive illness. But some people who were close to him have never been certain. The question of whether it was intentional or accidental has never been definitively resolved. Rodney Drake lived until 1988, Molly Drake until 1993. They spent their remaining years quietly tending to their son's legacy, answering letters, meeting fans, making sure the music stayed alive. Molly once said, "We were so absolutely thrilled to think that Nick was happy, because there hadn't been any happiness in Nick's life for years." She was talking about those final recording sessions, the last time music brought him back. Everyone who knew Nick Drake carries a version of him that is slightly different from everyone else's. Gabrielle knew the boy who threw records onto beds and disappeared. Robert Kirby knew the collaborator who heard things in silence. John Martyn knew the ghost who came for an hour and left nothing but his absence. Joe Boyd knew the artist who refused to be saved until, briefly, he wasn't refusing anymore. And Molly and Rodney Drake knew something none of the others did. They knew the child before the music, before the illness, before the legend. None of them got him back. None of them got to see what happened after. But here is what they did get. They got the music, and through the music, so did the rest of the world. Just 26 years too late. If this story moved you, subscribe to Unheard and Gone. A new story every day, and not one of them ordinary.